All righty. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Do we have anybody that needs a lesson? We handed out some last week. You've got the extras there? So it's sin despises the law. Does anybody need that one that we handed out last week? We just got started into it, and so we're going to push forward and see how far we can get through it tonight. Now, Sunday evenings are a little bit different than Sunday mornings, of course. We have a little bit more of an interactive time here where we go through and we're working on different topics or trends, and we deal with things that are happening in and around Christianity, in and around our culture. And so we've been, since January, working our way through, we began with a study on God and country, ? And out of that we dealt with the stuff that's happening around us. We've heard over and over the cultural Marxism and the critical race theory and all those things, and understanding that. But then we've spent and invested a great deal of time since then, after about 5, 6, 7 weeks of that. Since then we've been studying the biblical answer to that, and that the main answer, summing up how we deal with those things, is a proper understanding of the question, who is man? And so when we understand that, then that gives us all the fundamental foundations that we need to build upon from there to answer these questions and to deal with these cultural things that are sweeping through our society. And so we have the understanding that if you guys can go back, way back into the catacombs, when we began, the fundamental primary thing that we began with is our nature as a certain thing about us that gives us the foundation from which we build upon that. What is that? Okay, truth is, yes, but about us. Go way back. The most fundamental thing about us as who we are that gives us a starting point from which we build upon all the rest of our discussion. Yeah, we're creatures. Yeah, we are created beings, as opposed to, what's the other worldview? What's it say? Yeah, we come from that. We're the product of time and chance and a materialistic world, that there is no supernatural, there is no God, only the natural, and it's just a matter of time and chance evolved over time, and that you are basically a cosmic accident. That's the alternative. And with that starting point, you end up with all the stuff that we have that we're seeing that's coming up in our culture. And with the biblical starting point that we are creatures, that changes everything in how we look at ourselves. So, since we are creatures, what does that mean? Okay, that we have a creator. What else? We're subject to that creator, right? So, we are accountable to the creator. And since we are accountable, then that means we need to know in what way. And so we understand that God has revealed himself to us in two primary ways. What are those two primary ways? Actually, there's 2.5, if you want to call it. Two primary ways that God has revealed himself. Okay, so the first one would be creation, right? God has revealed his eternal attributes through what has been created, and we're a part of that. And also, God has revealed, I heard some of you say his word, himself through specific revelation, that being his word, and that also includes Jesus. Okay, Jesus. So God has revealed himself that way. And so we've been working, and the more that we understand that, the more that we understand that we're accountable, and what happened that changed everything. The original state of affairs, when we use the word natural, we always need to understand that the word natural goes for what time frame? Before sin, yes. Prior to the fall, the natural state of affairs, the way things were created originally, that's the way we need to understand the word natural, And from there, we understand that. Then we understand there's something happened that changed everything. That was the fall of man. And then everything has changed since then because sin has had great effects upon everything. And so we've been working our way through understanding how sin has affected everything. And now we're talking about tonight, and we began last week, about understanding about sin and the law. And when we talk about the law and what do we mean by that. And so when we talked about this last week and we introduced this, when we talk about the law, in what sense are we talking about this? Okay, God's moral law, which is universal in nature, right? So when we say it's universal in nature, it goes across all humanity for all time. So it began with whom? And has continued to this day. God's moral law, and it is that to which we are all accountable in all times, in all places, in all cultures. And where is that law written? It's written on our hearts. And so we understand that's what we're talking about here. Primarily when we're talking about sin and the law is this universal, ubiquitous law that is written upon our hearts and is applicable to all people in all times. Now we're going to talk about some nuances of the way the word law is used in Scripture that is very important. And we're going to get to that tonight, Lord willing. So we began with a little bit of an introduction, and then we talked about... Kelly, do you have any of those papers? Kind of helps me to see. I bet you this looks funny on the screen. Hey, Warren. He's probably covering his eyes and hiding under the... Okay, so, yeah, we talked about, and we got a little bit into this, we went through our introduction there, and we got into this part about God and law, and so we understand that God is the source of the law. The Bible describes God as a lawgiver. And so we see that throughout Scripture. God is the pattern for the law. The law mirrors God's own holy nature and will. Now this answers the question, how does God decide what commandments to bind upon us? So when we see laws or commandments that are found in Scripture, where do those come from? They come from God, right? But what about God? Where do they come from? Yeah, they're bound up in His... Every law, in some form or fashion, is bound up in His character and nature. Right? So God is truth, so He says, don't lie. Right? God values life. He is life, so He says, don't murder. Right? You see? Those are just really basic examples. And so God's law is bound up, and its true source and pattern is Himself and His character and nature and His will. Now we also understand that God has a purpose for the law, and that purpose is determined by His love for us. So God's law is linked to His love for us. In fact, everything about the creation of the universe is related to His love. The two main purposes of creation are these. God created for the purposes of displaying His His glory and sharing His goodness. We are thinking here especially about the latter. God made us human beings in His own image so that He could have a love relationship with us and share His goodness with us. And this is why He wants us to be holy as He is holy, because He loves us and wants us to be happy, and He knows that lives lived in imitation of His own holy character will be the happiest. Now, remember we had an illustration of what child care device. Yeah, a playpen, right? That we can think of God's law as kind of a playpen that if we remain within that law, then we have, what do we have if we remain in that law? We have freedom in that, right? Freedom to do. Now, if we step outside of that, then what's on the outside of God's law? Well, yeah, it's sin. Think in terms of death. Yeah. Ultimately death, right? Think in terms of a child. Why do you put him in a playpen? For safety, protection. Right? And so Um, outside of God's law, there is danger and harm and death. But within God's law, if we remain in it, then there is peace and safety and goodness. And so that is important to think about. So God has a purpose. You see, what are the guidelines then for such a holy and happy life if that's what God wants us to live? How do we know what God's holy character is? How do we know these things? The answer is the law. This is what the law is all about. God's holy nature is verbalized for us in His law. God's commandments show us His own holiness. Thus, the law of God shows us how to live according to His purpose for us. It is the manufacturer's instruction book on how to match our moral character with that of God Himself. So then we talked about the goodness of the law, and it's now made clear. Because of all the above, the law is good, Romans 7:16. So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good, Romans 7:12. God made the law great and glorious, Isaiah 42:21, and His commandments are not burdensome, 1 John 5:3. The law is for us and not against us. God wants us to obey it let me say that again. God wants us to obey it not just because He's the boss, which He is, but also because He loves us. So that was God and law. Now let's talk about, there's two things that we need to understand now. There's sinners in law and then Christians in law. So the way that the law and sinners interact and the way that Christians in law interact, and we're going to dig into this and try to understand this. Now, here we're going to explain how sinners relate to the law before dealing with how Christians relate to it. Now, at this point, we have to distinguish two different ways that the New Testament, now especially Paul, uses the concept of law. On the one hand, law refers to the list of commandments that constitute the category of law in a sense of our law code. So this moral law that we talk about, we could sum up as a law code. So we need to start getting that down in your mind, law code. And so all of our previous discussion has been about law in this sense. And this will be our main point here. On the other hand, sometimes when Paul writes, especially when Paul writes, the term law is used to refer to the law system. Now, the law system is bound up in what law? The Mosaic. Yeah, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. The law system, which is our attempt to get right with God or go to heaven by how well we are obeying our law code. In this sense, the law system of salvation is the alternative to and the opposite of the grace system. Now, we've talked about this many times, the grace system and the law system. And so we're going to break this down a little bit further. And so hopefully this will help us to understand, because this is a very important distinction. Now, this is something that probably we can go ahead and talk about here. Now, I don't remember what class it was in, but we talked about this quite a bit. Maybe you guys could refresh my memory. But we talk about, in theory, there are two gates into heaven. Okay? What are those gates? The law gate, grace gate. Okay, so with the law gate, what are the requirements for entering through that gate? Okay, keeping the law. Yeah, I heard to never sin. What's another way of saying it? Keeping the law fully and perfectly. Right, so how many human beings outside of Jesus have entered through that gate? Okay, this is why we use the word in theory, right? Because it's a gate, it's a way, but we understand through, in the book of Romans and many other scriptures, that all humans have what? Sin. So that means we are all law breakers, and if you break one, you've broken them all, right? In a certain sense. And so now Jesus, he could enter through the law gate. Now the other gate would be the grace gate. And so the law system, we could say, is attached to that idea of the law gate, whereas the grace system would be attached to the idea of the the grace system when we talk about systems of salvation. And that's an important distinction. And this, we'll see how this plays out here. Now, sinners in the law code. First, we take a look at how sinners relate to God's law in the sense of the law code, or list of commands we are obligated to obey. Based on biblical teaching, we must recognize that in the final analysis, sinners despise the law. They despise it and want it to be totally free from its constraints. We see this in the very definition of sin that is given in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. The key word in this verse is anomia, which is translated most frequently in one of two ways. Many versions, including the King James Version, say sin is the transgression of the law, the breaking of the command of the law. It is true that every individual act of law breaking is a sin. This is what makes it a sin. In some way, a sinful act is one that goes against the law of God. So every sin breaks God's law. There is another connotation to the word anomia, however, as indicated in many versions of the New Testament, that translate it thus: sin is lawlessness. And you see there at the top of your paper. Sin is not just an action. It is an attitude toward God's law. The very essence of sin is the attitude of hatred, hostility, contempt, rebellion, and opposition toward the law. Sin despises the law. Now, when we think of lawlessness, I don't know why my mind just went here, but my mind kind of goes back to the Old West, right? Where you get, some towns where lawlessness is just kind of the rule of the day. Whoever has the quickest gun is the one who's in control, and there's just no real law in what's going on. Yeah, or you can kind of look to our culture today when we talk about lawlessness and the things that we're seeing in our culture, and we trace that all the way back to one of our original studies where we got started, was a rejection of authority. A rejection of authority. Because in some form or fashion, all law is bound up in the nature of God. And for those that reject authority are rejecting God, they're rejecting His law. And so that's what we see here, is that there's very much a relationship between authority and law and the things that we're talking about here. So, sin is lawlessness, not just an action, it's an attitude toward God's law, and so forth, as we read there. Now, nothing is more characteristic of our culture than this spirit of lawlessness, which is actually the spirit of autonomy and a rejection of authority. The Greek word for law is nomos, and we see it in anomia, which is basically just the root word nomos preceded by the negating alpha. Putting the alpha, right? So we've seen this before. If you put a in front of a word, right? I had one in my head as a good example that we are all aware of, and now it has left the train station. I'm sorry. The letter A? Yeah, if you put the letter A. Okay, there you go. Yeah, if you use that concept, it does find its way into the English language as well. Like when you say moral, but if you say amoral, that means what? Without moral, right? And so, thank you. Yeah, that's a good example. So, that's what we see here. Putting the alpha, the Greek letter A, in front of the word in the Greek language is like putting an anti or non at the beginning of a word in English. Also, our word for autonomy comes from the Greek word nomos, and autos, which means the self or oneself. Thus, autonomy is the decision to be one's own lawgiver. I will make my own laws, thank you. It is the refusal to accept the authority of any law or rule that comes from outside oneself. And so that's what we see here today. So if we, in our culture here today, when we understand this autonomous viewpoint of ourselves, it's when we talk about in relationship to law and the way that we live in morality, is this concept of a subjective or objective law. And so what Satan has sold our society is that we can kind of make up our own laws. What does this look like? What does this sound like when it fleshes out in our society? Well, yeah. Well, what does it look like? What does it look like for someone when they're talking about a certain thing that they want to do or lifestyle? How does this play out? Yeah. And they might say, well, yeah, you may not agree with this. It's not right for you, but it's right for me. What they've done is they've internalized the source of authority. And so they've become autonomous. They have, yes, yeah. And so rather than looking to an objective outside source of morality, we make ourselves the standard of morality, and therefore you can do whatever you want. And that's what we see. And it does result in chaos. Now, this attitude of lawlessness and autonomy is pictured in Psalms chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, where the kings of the earth declare their freedom from the great king's law. Quote, why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. Here the fetters and cords represents the laws of the sovereign God, and the words of these culture kings, influential human leaders, express very clearly the basic attitude of sin. We refuse to be bound by the laws of God. That is our society. Now, why does this matter? What is so awful about despising and attacking the law? For one thing, it leads to the destruction of human society. But even more seriously, and this cannot be overemphasized, the sinner's attack on God's law is an attack on God himself. Remember back in the point that we talked about, God and his law cannot be separated. See, in Romans 8:7, the mind set on the flesh is hostile toward God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God. Romans 8:7. Hostility toward God and refusal to submit to law together. This is why so many people are professed atheists. Right? There we go. Atheist. That was it. Right? Right? Train's back in the station. All right, so theist, right? What's a theist? Yeah, that believes in God, right? All in front of it, without, right? So, yeah, there it is. How about that? Now I've lost my point. Where's the word atheist on here? Okay, yeah, this is why so many people are professed atheists. If we can just get rid of God, then we won't be bound by law anymore. Again, the fundamental factor we trace all the way back is understanding that we are created, that we're creatures and God is our creator. We are subject to him. When people can remove that dynamic from their thinking, then they can do whatever they want. And that's the primary motivation. Again, for the bajillionth time, we find this completely spelled out in what book and chapter of the Bible? Romans chapter 1. Is that, now, when someone says they're an atheist, are they diminishing the reality of God and who he is? Are they diminishing it in any way? Is God any less real? No, what are they doing? They're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. The motive is we want to sin. We want to be autonomous. We want to make our own law. Romans chapter 1, that's it. That's the snapshot of our culture. Now, the spirit of lawlessness permeates most of our culture, which, as we know, is shaped to a large extent. So, in our culture, in the here and now, all right, let's think about this. Let's think about worldviews and how they've developed over time. So, when we think about the time, let's just look at biblical times, right? What worldviews were present that shaped how people acted? What had they constructed? Okay, all right. So, well, if we look into Rome, we could say Caesar worship. You know, we're talking about all the cultures of, think about the time, the ones we read about in the Bible. And so I heard idol worship, right? We see that a lot. There's idol worship. What else is happening? What worldviews are present in and around? Yeah, this idea of polytheism, yeah, many gods, right? So what systems are present at this time? Come on now. Greek? No, Jesus. Yeah, remember the Bible, the time of Jesus when he was there, right? Yeah. Greek, yeah, all the Greek gods, right? Were those present? Remember Paul and Barnabas? Who were they? Yeah, they said that this is Zeus and Hermes, right? Well, that's a worldview they were working with. Right? Remember when they went to Athens and Mars Hill and they saw all these altars on the hillside to the god of everything because they were trying to stop a drought? Right? And finally, so Paul was working within so those were all systems of very polytheistic, idol worship and that kind of stuff. But what we don't see very much is this idea of atheism. That there is no God whatsoever, right? There was so a lot. Now, if we think about in Ephesus, the temple of Diana, Artemis, right? And so they devise systems that promoted what lifestyle. Yeah, right? Yeah, we have these temples where there's temple prostitutes and all these sexual activity. Remember we talked about Molech? Yeah, going back to that worldview and those things there. What was the reason? Why did they have Molech and what went on there? Yeah, because they had a bunch of unwanted babies. Why? Because there was a sexually promiscuous society where anything went. So they devised systems. A lot of times it's in and around surrounding sexual sin. Now, what happened, if we look in our culture here today, there was a certain event, philosophical event that changed everything and gave us a real foothold for what we now call atheists or even new atheists. What was it? No? No, you got to go back further than that. That gives us the foundation for an atheistic worldview where God does not exist. Remember, go back to... Okay, got to go back further than that. Hey, Charles Darwin, there we go, right? Charles Darwin wrote what book? The Origin of Species, right? And so his theory is that everything we see is evolved. And so then we have that worldview now. We have that starting point that now says that people can go, oh, wait, we're just stuff. So now remember we talked about this? And this is kind of philosophical, but we talked about a closed system and an open system. A closed system, in a closed system, all there is the box. Right? Remember we did the Truth Project a long time ago? And you have that box. So all that exists is the box, material, stuff, and we're a part of that. Right? But an open system says what? There's stuff outside the box, and that stuff would be God. There's supernatural. Super doesn't mean like, it doesn't mean super. What it means is outside of. Right? God is holy, W-H-O-L-L-Y, other. Right? So... They're laughing at me. All right, so there's. I'm doing what? Take a breath? I'd take a drink of water, but can't handle it. All right, so Tony Sullivan did. He brought one right in here. All right, he'll be back, and I bet you'll have another water when he comes. I know, I'm just messing. Somebody give me a water. All right. Yeah. So we're talking about a closed system and an open system. And so Darwin says, no, closed system, nothing outside of the box. It's only the stuff in there. Where we start having this idea of materialism and naturalism. And from this now we have atheism. There is no God. And so that's a whole other thing. And so if we can remove God altogether, then this is the spirit of lawlessness that permeates most of our culture, which, as we know, is shaped to a large extent by Darwin's theory of evolution. Those who have studied the life of Charles Darwin know that part of his motivation for devising evolutionism was his desperate attempt Now, I don't know if you know this or not. You can read up on this because this is absolutely true statement. Was his desperate attempt to escape a universe designed by God. That was his motivation. This comes out in his open opposition to the influential Christian writer William Paley. Now, if you can remember influential Christian writer William Paley and what he is known for, you get 2 million points. William Paley. So he was an influential Christian writer who wrote and came up with something fantastic that has really spawned an entire philosophical understanding that really gives us a great argument for the existence of God. William Paley started this. Anybody know? Anybody want to take a shot? Oh, Randy gets 2 million points. Oh, he stood up. Yeah. See, if you look now, you can see his top of his head. It's a little bright. All right, so the light's hitting it. So he's not doing that. All right, so William Paley was known for the argument of the watch found in the woods. The what? You said that? You could have had 2 million points, right? Yeah, like at the Bible Bowl thing. All right, now, so what was William Paley or Paley's argument? Paley's argument. What did he say? Right. Okay, so you're going through the woods and you stumble upon this beautiful, intricate wristwatch, this timepiece, and you pick it up and you say, "Ooh, look what time and chance and nature has done," right? And even a kid would be like, "Well, that's you got to be, yeah." I mean, come on, somebody made that thing, and so it's the argument of design. That if something looks designed and is designed, then it has a designer. And the more that we understand the universe, this is what we're going to get to in our apologetics class. We're going to really get into this stuff and really work our way through it. But this is what's called the teleological argument for God's existence. And it's bound up in William Paley's stuff here. So if something appears to be designed and has the features of design, then it has a designer. And therefore, the universe shows signs of design. Therefore, the universe has a designer. Okay. And so, Darwin was writing to refute him. And so, this comes out in open opposition to the influential Christian writer William Paley, who is famous for his popularization of the teleological argument for God's existence, the predecessor to the modern intelligent design. So if you've ever heard of intelligent design movement, that was started with really got its feet on the ground with a Christian author by the name of Michael Behe, and Stephen Meyer and others have built upon it. It's great stuff. And so a modern parallel to Darwin's anomia is modern science's desperate search for evidence of life on planets other than Earth. Why have we said, why is science so tore up? Why are people so desperate to try to find life on other planets? What is their goal? Yeah, it's still this desperate attempt to say that God doesn't exist. Because what have they found? What have they found which undermines the theory of evolution? There's tons of scientific discoveries that have happened. Yeah, DNA is one. The more that they understand the intricacies of the cell, the more that they realize that there is no way this stuff happened by chance. The idea of irreducible complexity is that you can't take something that needs 187 parts to work and have 112 of them and still call it a foot that functions properly. You need all the parts there from the beginning in order for it to work. That's the idea of irreducible complexity. And so there are all these different things that science, there's more and more. It's just like you cannot get around it. And understanding, too, that the universe has a beginning and had a starting point, and all these different things that we talk about and that we're going to talk about in our apologetics class. I pray to talk about it then. But it's the reason that they're trying to find life on other planets is because they've gotten to the point where they can say that stuff is just too designed and intricate to be chance. And so they're trying to put it, saying, well, there was life on other planets, and they gave, we came from them who were advanced civilizations. Now, you're probably thinking that I'm crazy and I've lost my mind, but this is where they're going, I promise you. They are looking for a modern parallel. There's this desperate search for life on other planets. Now, a major figure in the Death of God movement in the 1960s, you guys familiar with this? Death of God in the 1960s. What publication? Yeah, Time magazine, and the cover of it said, God is dead, right? They've since published a couple others with other things. So the Death of God movement in the 1960s was Thomas Altizer, who wrote The Gospel of Christian Atheism. He fantasizes that Jesus was actually God incarnate who deliberately became a human being so that he could be put to death and stay dead, and he did this for our sake so that we would no longer be bound by the alien power of the moral imperative. It's craziness. A law that comes from outside ourselves. Thus, the only way we can imagine that we are under some moral demand is to be estranged from Christ, the Christ of his imagination, of course. So Altizer invites us to make a wager, to bet that the Christian God is dead, and thus we are free from obligation, guilt, and condemnation because there is no longer any law. He says, no, quote, no, we are not guilty, says the Christian who bets that God is dead. His very bet denies the alien authority of the imperative and refuses all that guilt arising from a submission to repression. He bets that he is even now forgiven, that he has been delivered from all bondage to the law, and that guilt is finally a refusal of the gift of life and freedom of Christ. Needless to say, such a wager entails a risk. This is stuff from this guy's book. It's absolutely incredible that somebody would come up with this. The point is that to despise the law is to despise God himself. To rebel against the law is to rebel against God. To commit even one sin against God is an accusation against God and an insult and a challenge toward God. As Stephen Charnock says, we are showing contempt for the holiness of God when we rebel against the law. Quote, we cast dirt upon the holiness of God when we blame the law of God because it shackles us and prohibits our desired pleasures, and hate the law of God as they did the prophets because they did not prophesy smooth things. Also, we are contrary to the law when we wish it were not so exact, and therefore contrary to the holiness of God, which set the stamp of exactness and righteousness upon it. Okay, well, we have some more. We've got about 5 minutes here. Let's just finish this section here and then we'll be setting the stage for next week's Sinners and the Law System. Now, the modern writer R.C. Sproul, now here in parentheses we say, forget for a moment that he is a Calvinist, makes this point in an excellent way in his book, The Holiness of God. Sproul writes, sin is cosmic treason. Sin is treason against a perfectly pure sovereign. It is an act of supreme ingratitude toward one to whom we owe everything, to the one who has given us life itself. Have you ever considered the deeper implications of the slightest sin, of the most minute peccadillo? What are we saying to our Creator when we disobey Him at the slightest point? We are saying no to the righteousness of God. We are saying, God, your law is not good. My judgment is better than yours. Your authority does not apply to me. I am above and beyond your jurisdiction. I have the right to do what I want to do and not what you command me to do. The slightest sin is an act of defiance against this cosmic authority. It is a revolutionary act, a rebellious act, where we are setting ourselves in opposition to the one to whom we owe everything. It is an insult to His holiness. That is an incredible description of us in our relationship as sinners in the law. Now, we're going to add one more selection from Charnock's work. Quote, "It's no slight thing then to fly in the face of God, to break his eternal law, to dash both to the tables and pieces, to trample the transcripts of God's own nature under our feet, to cherish that which is inconsistent with his honor, to lift up our heels against the glory of his nature, to join issue with the devil in stabbing his heart and depriving him of his life. Sin in every part of it is in opposition to the holiness of God." So that is an understanding of sinners and the law code. And we're going to get into this sinners and the law system, and that will start to make sense of what we mean as a distinction between the law code and the law system, and that'll help us a little bit here. So, any questions or comments about anything that we've covered here tonight?